Welcome back to the Practical Microservices stream. um, Today we are going to continue working on the identity component, fleshing that out some more. I did want to just, of course, call attention to the fantastic daily content that you can get at practicalmicroservices.com. Let me pull this up real quick. On LinkedIn this morning, I read some financial people talking about the importance of emergency funds. And like one of the objections people give to emergency funds is that, wow, that's a lot of cash that just sits around doing nothing. The point of it, like that's missing the point of what an emergency fund is. It gives you financial flexibility when things happen. And it occurred to me that a similar attitude goes along in software development, right? We need to keep our people busy all the time. If they're not coding every hour of the day, then what are we getting from them? Well, you're reserving capacity so that you can have flexibility when a bug is discovered or a new opportunity comes along. If your people are engaged to the max all the time, you don't have flexibility anymore and you can't react to new things. And so I think that's a good post. So, and it was fun finding this burning cache image to work as the background. Anyway, let's dive in. I'm going to close all of these Rails things, and we don't need the UI of the app for a little bit here. Probably won't need that one, or this, or that, or that, or that. Hey, look at that. We can just have the event type documentation open. That's fantastic. So yesterday, right at the end of the day, we got the golden path test working for the register handler in the identity component. Today, we'll just continue with fleshing that component out. We'll start writing the idempotence test. And when we do that, that's going to pull into existence the projection tests and so on and so forth. Stuff we've done before, but we need to get through it. So let's just dive straight in to what we're working on. So for that, we're going to be in test automated handle commands register. And now we are adding the ignored test. Like so, and get some of this boilerplate here. Boilerplate, of course, is the worst thing ever in programming and makes everything harder to work on. No, just kidding. Boilerplate is just not that big of a deal in practice. It's never been my typing speed that's held me back from shipping product. So let's see, Ruby test automated. I mean, like, I don't seek out boilerplate. I'm just not worried about it that much. All right, there's that. Cool. So let's see. To do this test, we are going to need a register command. We can just go ahead and grab that from right there. Test is still passing. We would exercise the handler. But of course, to do that, we're going to need an identity entity here. So we'd go to controls, identity, and we would want an example of one that has been registered, like so. And this is where we're going to fail because we don't have that control yet. We do have the identity control, but we don't have the actual scenario that we're looking at here. So let's come over to lib identity component controls identity. Let's open that file. And then we can come down. Oh, I guess I called it identified. Where do we use that? Just curious. I want to look under lib for this. Maybe we use it in some tests. We don't. Huh. Why do I have this here? Yeah, I don't like that name for it. So let's make it registered. We weren't using the other anywhere. We could verify that real quick by, well, I guess we'd have to run the full test suite to verify that. Okay, great. So let's see. What would a registered identity look like? This would be one that, suppose if we will have to open the actual entity class here. So far, it only has the ID on it. So one that has registered will have an ID. It will have an email. So we have an email example that we can use, and it will have a password hash. We should still be passing. Why did that? Oh, right. That didn't work because we haven't put those attributes on the class here. So attribute email, that's a string, and attribute password hash is also a string. Great. But now here's the thing. This identity won't actually make use of any of those properties. So we don't like, when you do a projection, you can project every attribute onto the entity, but we don't need every attribute on this entity. We will need the email because we're going to be sending an email to this user via the send email component that we developed a while ago. But the password hash we won't need. So you know what? We're just going to go ahead and leave that right off because there's no need for it at all. All right, so with that identity then, we're not quite pulling this in the right order. Hang on a second. Let's continue and get our failing assertion in place, and then that will dictate all the rest of the stuff that we need. So get access to the writer class via handler.write, and then with that, we would say, oh man, I'm struggling to remember typical way to write this, but that's why we have the other code. I think I say that every time I say I don't remember how to do this. Let's see, practical microservices and email component would have an example. So we go to test and automated handle commands. Oh, wait a second. I totally got to change what we're talking about here. We had our meetup last night. It went great. And one of the people who attended described it as fantastic. It was so collaborative and educational. We worked through 5.5 solutions to a design flaw, and it was really interactive and open. That was really cool to get that feedback for, because that's exactly what we go for. Just we're trying to advance the state of the art of building systems this way, and the only way to do that I think is to have an open environment where people can come and talk about what they're doing and discuss ideas. And at least last night we pulled that off. So here's to doing that some more in the future. Anyway, that was fun to say. Let's see here. So I wanted to go look at tests. Here's the ignored one. Yeah, we want to see if it wrote a message. So we would say the message that would be written from this would be registered. So then we would say writer.one message do. It would be an event that we would expect. So event.instance of messages events registered. So basically we're saying, hey, writer, did you get anything that is a registered event? And then we'll put a test in there. Let's see. Registered was not written. And so then we would assert that registered is nil. Like so. And this should now fail at the assertion because we are indeed writing the event. So now is where we realize, oh, well, we need to put into the entity store an instance of the entity that is in this registered state. And that is what this is pulling off. So an entity that has an ID or an email on it is one that has been registered. That's the first event that comes in to one of these streams, is that registered event. So what do we want to do here? We have the identity, we would need to add that to the store. So we would say handler store add. Now there's going to be an identity ID here, and then we would add the identity like so. Now we need to make sure that the identity ID matches. Do we need to actually make sure of that? No, we just need to make sure it was added with the same identity ID that this register has. So we could just say register.identity ID, or we could do it as a precondition, which makes a lot more sense. So then this would just become identity ID. And now what's really important is technically this code shouldn't be here yet. So we want to see that failing test. Identity ID is a field on the register command, so that won't give us our failure, but we would expect to hit a runtime error on line 10 there. We didn't. Oh, we're right, because register already has the identity ID. It's the identity entity that doesn't have it, so my mistake. Good to have that precondition in place, though, because if we don't have that identifier, that none of the rest of the tests would make sense. So we're going to stuff that identity into the entity store so that when we go to project the entity in question, it comes back as having been registered already. And so we have some methods that are missing here, and that's fine. We're trying to, again, pull them into existence. So and what I mean by that is we don't imagine code that we're going to need. We have a test. We write a test that's going to check for something. And to get that test to fail, to get that test to pass, there's code that we have to write to make that work. That's what pulling it into existence means. Nothing is written unless there is some demonstrated need for it, some consumer of it, which in our case is the test. And it's a good way to organize work in general. Like rather than imagining features that your customers would want, observe your customers, talk to them, understand their workflows and what they're trying to accomplish. And that will tell you what to put in. Not listening necessarily to your customer saying, oh, I want feature X, because I don't know, in my experience, users, customers, we're bad at coming up with solutions, but we do know our problems. And so when you're building a product, when you're providing a professional service, you listen, you figure out who you want to serve, and then you listen to their problems, and then you come up with an idea like, would this be a useful solution? And you can do that in an hour, just really rough sketch or a description of something. If you had blah, would that make your life a little bit easier? And if they say no, well, then come up with something else. You've only lost an hour versus build an entire product and then find out nobody wants it. I don't know. I just think it's a much cheaper way to figure out what doesn't work than building entire products. Not an original thought to me, right? I've read the works of people who have discovered that principle and they resonate. Anyway, let's see here. Completely lost my train of thought. What were we doing? Right, we were going to the command handler because we need to make this idempotent. So the way we would get that to not write the event again is we would need to project the state of our identity. So we would say identity equals store.fetch the identity ID, like so. And then we would say if identity dot registered, well, then we're going to ignore something. And I'm going to grab this code right here, which gives an example log statement to put that in there. So logger info tag ignored, command ignored. This would not be do something. It would be registered. And then the identity ID is that. So now we'll get an error because registered is not a method on the class, which is exactly what that's saying. So we don't want the controls. We want the actual identity class here. And what we would say is this registered method, the way these typically play out is you look for some attribute that would only be set if the condition, the state that you're describing is valid. So in our case, if you have an ID, you'd be registered. But a method that ends in a question mark is supposed to return true or false, not truthy or falsy. So we can just not it. So if it's non-nil, we'll switch it to false, but then we'll switch it back to true. And just basically make sure that we're returning a Boolean value. Now, I think this should pass because well, actually it won't. No, this is good. This is where this commenting out mattered right here. We haven't set the ID on this, so it will still come through as not registered. So we should still see the assertion error, which is what we got. Now we'll just fix our control. Now it passes. So now this handler is idempotent. I think we're going to finish the other test here, the expected version test. If we were to start up the component, it wouldn't yet be idempotent because we don't have the projection in place that would put the entity. So we just grabbed an entity that's in this correct state for having been registered, but we don't have a projection to build that from an actual stream of events yet. So that's coming, but first of all, I'm just going to go ahead and remove all these comments now because I used the boilerplate that I wanted. Make sure our test suite runs. It does. Cool. So with that in place, we won't need the entity anymore. And I don't think we will actually, we will be making a change to the control here, but not yet. Because we're going to, once it's registered, we then handle that to send an email. And so we'll want to make sure that that handling is also idempotent. So we're going to do the expected version test. It's not necessarily an error. And so expected version, like so. And then we can come over here and test automated, handle commands, register, expected version. Like so. So we are still handling commands. We are still handling register. This is the expected version test. Give me 1 second while I mute. Oh, hey, I'm back. All right. So handler test. First thing we need is an instance of our handler. Handlers commands.new. We will need a register command. So we get that from controls commands register.example. Like so. We'll need to invoke the handler. And I'm just going to run this real quick. Make sure we're not messing up any of that. And we'll say, hey, writer, you're equal to handler.write. And then we'll say registered equals writer.one message do event. That event should be an instance of, do we do that? Do we check the type of it in these tests? Why aren't you switching to the other window? There we go. Yes, because we need to get the right type of message. It's not necessarily that we're going to write it differently, but this is the way that we're able to tell. Like we need a reference to the event that was written and it has to be of the correct type. So messages, events, registered. And it may be that we don't need a separate test to make sure it's there. Yeah, we're using this as a retrieval method to get the instance here. The real thing that we're after is what version was it written with, right? Yes. All right, I'm trying to commit that to memory. So we would put in a test here that we would say written with the expected version. Like so. And what do we call that by convention? Written to stream? I don't like written to stream there. That's not. Yeah, fine. Just keep consistency. Let's see. We would do writer. Nope. We need to set that equal to something. Writer dot written. Pass it registered. Do. Now, instead of getting the stream name this time, what we're after is the expected version it was written with. This is the same method. Let me open the other test. Automated handle commands, register, registered. We're using the same writer.written method that we use when we're checking to make sure it's written to the correct stream. This time we're just checking to make sure it was written with the correct expected version. So what we would do is expected version we got from the method that we're calling writer.written. We pass it a block. It passes us the expected version. And we would need this to equal some value that we don't have yet, which is called version. So we'll get a name error on version, right? That doesn't exist. So we need to know what that is. So we would say version. What does a version look like? Well, the generator puts a control in place that gives us that. The number one, because these versions, they're just integers. I mean, they can grow very large, but they're just an integer number. And so, yeah, we could be like, it equals 1. But we don't want to think in terms of what it specifically is. That's what controls are for. Controls tell us what they specifically are. I couldn't imagine a scenario in which the version would change what it is. Like suddenly it becomes letters. That would be weird. But who knows? Maybe you have a database that represents things with hexadecimal rather than decimal numbers. Just saying. So we have an example of the version, but what we need now is for the when it projects the entity right now, it's going to get one at -1 because there isn't nothing in the stream yet. But we would like that to not be that. We want it to be this version number. I'm suppressing a sneeze. It's not brilliant. So we would have to say handler store. We need to add something to you. We did this in the idempotence test just a moment ago. Well, how do we do that? Well, we need an identity ID, which we don't have, so that's going to fail. We do have... Actually, we don't. We don't have the identity either. That will fail. But now we have a version. So when you go to add something to the entity store and you use this method in test, you wouldn't do that in an operational scenario. You pass it the identifier for the entity itself, and then the version you would like it to be at if you're doing that. So if we run this, our first error will be on identity ID, I believe, because it goes left to right. Yep. So after the register, we can say identity ID is equal to register.identity ID or fail. That's a precondition. Now we should fail on identity not being there, which is what we failed on. So we can say, hey, identity, you're going to be equal to controls identity dot example. We can just go with the current example. We don't need this one to be in a special state. We just need an instance. So I guess we could just build a new one if we wanted to as well. No, this is what we would, So we don't want one that has been registered. So let's have a look at the control real quick. What will the example give us? If we just say, call the example one, we get one with an ID. Oh, something happened time. That's a relic of the, generator. Sorry, lost the word again. So this registered one, we're taking the new example and just adding these things directly, which doesn't give us the ability to control the ID at all. I'm going to just do this, not new example, and get rid of all of those. So the example one is just the registered one. I mean, most identities are going to be registered. And when we finally get the one where the email has been sent, we'll change the example to it at that point, probably, because like, what is the most likely scenario for these identities to be in? It's that they've been registered and we've sent the email, because there's going to be like a 2-second window where they've been registered and the email hasn't been sent. But we pull things into existence. We don't do it prematurely. All right. So in this case, then, we would want the new one. Because we want one that hasn't been registered. Now, strictly speaking, we wouldn't have one of these new ones in a state where the expected version could be 1, but we're not really interested in the exact values here. We're just saying that anytime that we fall through and we end up writing this registered event, we want to make sure we passed along whatever the version the entity store told us the entity was at. So now that we have the ID, the identity, and the version, we can go ahead and add those to the store. And now I think what we should have is it saying, hey, you have no test, you have no assertion within this test, because now everything would have worked. Test did not perform an assertion. Great. So we would just come down here and say that we would refute. No. That returns a Boolean. So we just return written to stream. And now we get an assertion failure. So now we need to change the handler to make use of this. And the way that we do that is it's just when we project it, we're going to also get the version. And then we would say here, include version. And then when we go to write, we say expected version is equal to that version. And now the test should pass. It didn't. Well, that's disappointing. What went wrong? I am genuinely baffled by that. Let's have a look at our other one here. Might have sent the wrong, like misspelled something or something like that. So we include version, and when we write, it is expected version that we say there. All right, let's come back. Make sure everything's saved. It is. Just rerun for good measure. And we are failing at line 31, which is right there. So maybe we don't pass that directly. No, that's what we do right there. So let's come back to our code here. So we're adding it to the store under that identity ID. And we fetch it using the register commands identity ID. And we include the version. And then when we go to write, we do that. Is there something wrong with the control? Let's have a look at that. So it's just going to build one. So the ID and all that. Wait a second. Why is that not saved? If things aren't saved, we can't trust anything we see. We're making a new one. And it's just going to build one. So ID and email would both be nil. So the registered check should still happen. So I think we are making it past here. So I'm going to put in a binding.irb real quick. And what is the version that we got? It's 1. Okay, so that would suggest that that's what we're getting. Sorry, I'm pointing to the screen and you can't see that. We are putting it into the entity store correctly in this case. Oh, duh. Duh. You have to pass the version, not the symbol version. Yeah, that's silly. There we go. Okay, now it's fixed. We are now protected against concurrency errors. So good stuff. Let's go ahead and cross that off. So that whole thing is done, actually. Let's just... Because I'm obsessed with things like that. There we go. So now we need to write our projection test. Again, if we were to actually fire this up and run it, we wouldn't be idempotent. We would just write the message every time, because that fetch command, or that fetch call that we make here on line 24, it doesn't know how to actually project one of these. And in test, we make it work because we're able to just inject things into the entity store. We need that to actually come from a projection. So if we open the projection file, you'll notice it's still here, very much the result of having run the generator. Did I clear out? I did. Okay. Yeah, there's all those comments, and they're really helpful, especially when you're first doing this, but I like to clear them out as we move along. So with that being the case, we need to add another test folder here, and we'll say projection. And we are going to project the registered event. Like so. Actually, it's this one. So let's open test automated projection registered, because we're always projecting events. You don't project commands. Require relative, and one level takes us to where automated init would be in this one. Let's go ahead and run that. Automated projection registered, no failures. Great. So context is projection. And context here is registered. And one thing worth pointing out, like, why did we say projection here, is because we're doing the projection. Now we're doing it because the class that we're testing is named projection. So they happen to be the same, that we've named it after the construct that it is. But you could have a component with more than one projection. And if you did that, I would have a folder for each projection class. We just happen to call this projection class projection. So that's the confusion. Maybe there was no confusion there. So if we're going to do this, we would need a registered event. And to do that, we would go to our controls events and get a registered. And if I'm not mistaken, we do not actually have that. No, we do. We put it in place so that the user credentials aggregator could be built. Oh, but look at that. We missed something when we refactored, when we changed the name there. So let's see here. In our controls file, in lib identity component controls events registered, this is supposed to be identity ID right there, like so. Great. So we've got that. Now we would need an identity here. So we could say controls identity. And by identity, I mean the entity class that we're projecting. So we grab that and we say, let's grab the new one, because that would be the correct state for one that hasn't been registered yet. Make sure that runs, does. And now we would want to actuate the projection, like so. And what's the call order here? Let's just try it. I think it should be the entity and then the event. We didn't crash, so there's a good chance that's right. So now we would want to make sure that the ID is set. And do we wrap those in an attributes thing typically? Let's have a look, see. Yeah, we do. Okay. Oh yeah, there's probably some preconditions to do there. Anyway, let's put this context attributes right there. And ID is one of those attributes. Oh yeah, and of course, don't have to worry, we would have pulled them into existence. If this projection worked properly, then we would expect the identity's ID to be equal to identity ID, which doesn't exist yet. So we'll get a name error on that. which there we go. There's that name error. So come up here and add a precondition that the identity ID should be equal to registered.identity ID or fail. And in this case, we won't get the runtime error because we are already putting that into the control right here. And that's fine. Typically, we don't want to write an assertion that will pass the first time. This isn't an assertion. This is a precondition. We're just saying we need to have that on there for the rest of this test to make sense. And if that is already in place, fantastic. So this should fall through to being an assertion error on line 15 rather than a runtime error. And that's what we got. So that's good. So now we just build the projection here. So we are ready to include the messages events now. That's a fine name for the entity. So we open or declare the block there. This should say registered, which is the name of the event. Well, it's the class that we are, it's the event class that we're projecting right now. And just by convention, we name the variable the same thing. We're not dealing with time on this, which is just to make it simpler. But we can have this set attributes call right here. And we're saying copy onto the identity from the source, which is registered. And here are the specific attributes to copy. And guess what? Identity ID on the source happens to not match the corresponding place where we would want to put that on the destination. So we're saying map identity ID to ID. And the follow that we use in the handlers uses set attributes under the hood. But by default, it copies everything. We're saying explicitly only copy these right now so that we can get this mapping. And by virtue of specifying the copy, what it means is that we will get to see an assertion failure when we add the email one, which we didn't when we were doing the command handler test. So now I believe this should pass. There we go. So the next one, we would come down here, and now we want to make sure that it is projecting the email on there, which, stop the presses, we don't actually need that yet. So I'm going to remove that. And in fact, I'm going to go one further and say, excuse me, that our control here for the registered doesn't need that yet either. We don't have a demonstrated need for it. To know that it's registered, all we need to know is that the ID was set on there. When we get to sending the email, we will come back and add it. But if you only ever add code that you need, you don't get a bunch of untested code, which, I mean, TDD isn't a testing exercise, but if you don't need something, don't put it in place because it's something that you need to deal with and maintain. And so there we go. For our intents and purposes at this moment in time, we are now projecting the registered event correctly. So that's great. Let's come back. So this would be the registered projection test. We just did that. Look at that. We are ahead of schedule. So the next thing to do is handle the registered event. I don't have a diagram of this, but the flow for the identity component is that it gets a register command from the UI and produces registered events in response to those commands. But part of the registration process is that we email the user like, hey, thanks for signing up for the site. We have the send email component already. We did that months ago. So now we're going to handle this registered event within the identity component and have it write that command to the send email component to send an email. So handle the registered event. So we need the handle events tests. We will do the send, because handling the registered results in a send command. So we'll have a send test. We'll have an ignored because we are going to observe the event streams for the send email component to see when it has its sent that corresponds to our send. And then we'll add a registration email sent event or whatever the type is. We'll look at that in a minute. Probably not today. We won't get that far. And then we will also have the idempotence check on it to make sure that if we have already sent the email, we're not going to send the command again. Strictly speaking, we don't have to do that, but it's just a performance thing. Why write all these commands we don't need when it's not that hard to not do it? And then we'll have the, we won't have the concurrency check on it because we're just writing a command. And so we don't care about stream version all the time. Like in the reservation pattern, it's entirely based on the expected version, but not in the same way. So let's just get it. And then we'll have another projection to write. No, we will modify the projection here because when we go to send the email, we will need the email address. So that's where we will add that back into the projection that I had added prematurely. So with that in mind of what we're going to do, let's just go ahead and do it here. So we'll need to add a handle events folder. Within there, we will be handling the registered event, and we are looking at the case where we write a send command. So test automated handle events, registered send, require relative. Yes, I could copy all this. I could write a generator, but I'm really trying to commit what all this stuff is to muscle memory. So the context here is we are handling events. Furthermore, we are handling the registered event. And furthermore, it is a case where we are going to write a send like so. Let's take that much and run it. Handle events, registered, send. Haha, there we go. We have a problem, right? Because it's not automated. It's automated in init. And that's why I like to run things frequently, early and often, just like voting. So if we're going to do a handler, we would say handlers events dot new. Do we have such a handler class? I think we do. The generator put one in place and we haven't deleted it, so we're good to go there. So then we would need a registered event, and we would get that from our controls events registered dot example. Are we still cooking with gas? We are. Fantastic. So let's actuate the handler with that event. We should still be good. And then we want to say, hey, let handler, let's get an access to your writer, handler.write, and then say, hey, writer, not sent. We want the command version of that. So writer.one message do command this time is what we expect. So we'll just call it that. And we want to say that command is an instance of messages, commands, send. No assertion so far. Nothing should be failing. Ah, but something did fail. Oh, right. Duh. Yeah, it's not messages, command, send. This would be coming from the send email component. I don't know if we have pulled that gem into this project. So what it would be is send email client messages commands send. That's what it should be. And I'm expecting a name error at send email. Oh, handler.write failed. Oh, read the message and don't just assume things, son. Here we go. Let's come up and have a look at our handler. Sure, because we haven't declared anything in it. So let's see here. We would have a dependency called write. That would be an instance of messaging Postgres write. There we go. I believe that's what it is. Let me open the command one real quick and go to the top. Yes, messaging Postgres write. Good stuff. All right, so I want to get to the failing test so that we have a place to come back, and we can do that real quick here. So we just want to say that the command was, let's see, send command was written, and we would refute send being nil. And that assertion should fail because we didn't actually write anything. There we go. And because we didn't write anything, we didn't, like, this block never executed, so we don't get the error on the send email client not being there. But we'll get that very quickly next time we're together, which will probably be Monday if all goes as planned. Hope you have a lovely weekend. Thanks for coming today. Catch you next time on the Practical Microservices stream. And until then, happy coding.